Hello, I'm Matt Carpenter, and this is the Good Life Podcast. Hello, welcome to the Good Life Podcast. I'm Matt Carpenter, and I'm glad today to welcome Aaron Renn. Aaron has worked as a writer, a consultant, an urban policy analyst, and has written quite a bit about the problems and solutions going forward for the church in the 21st century. He is most recently the author of Life in the Negative World, and it is a book especially designed to help Christians think about what we're facing right now and the challenges that come with living in this part of the 21st century. So Aaron, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me on.
So let's begin with a summary of your thesis, which I know you've given perhaps hundreds of times at this point. So this time I will try to summarize your thesis, and you can then grade me on how well I do on this. So in your book, Life in the Negative World, is based on the article you wrote in First Things magazine and originally in your masculinist newsletter about the three worlds of evangelicalism. So the first one you say is the positive world from 1964 to 1994, where Christianity was considered a positive attribute in culture. So mainline denominations are strong. You could actually find Billy Graham crusades played on primetime television on occasion there. So it was viewed well. And then the neutral world is 1994 to 2014, where being a Christian no longer has extra benefits socially, certainly not, at least not in large urban areas, but it's not a drawback either. So you don't lose points on a job application because you are a Christian. And then the negative world is 2014 to the present, where being a Christian and Christian morality is considered culturally backward in some sense. And for many Christians, if they want to attain positions of prestige, they feel like they need to hide their beliefs. So how did I do as summarizing your thesis?
I think that's basically about right, yeah.
So one of the things recently that struck me about the neutral world perspective, there was my wife and I recently watched a Hugh Grant and Sarah Jessica Parker movie made in 2009 called Did You Hear About the Morgans? Have you seen that? Did you ever see that movie?
I have not.
Okay, so a New York couple who are married, their marriage is on the rocks. They witness a murder, and they're sent to a small town in Wyoming under the Witness Protection Program. And of course, it's classic fish out of water story. But the conservative values in this small Wyoming town, and even there is a hat tip to Christianity. They call themselves a God-fearing place. Those things are viewed as different than the New York urban beliefs, but still as something that can be appreciated. And I told my wife that movie could not be made today.
Mm-hmm.
So, you emphasize in your book, though, that these three worlds are ongoing. What does it look like for you right now where you sit, because you live in Indiana? I mean, is this something that affects every place, or is all the geography of the United States, are they all stuck in the negative world, or do we see it stronger, more negative in some places than others?
There's a quip, I don't know where it originated, that the future is here, it's just unevenly distributed. I do think that the cultural conditions are different depending on where you live. If you live in San Francisco, you're probably in a more oppressive environment ideologically in terms of progressivism. If you live here in suburban Indianapolis like I do, I'm not going to say most people go to church, but lots of people go to church. Being known as someone who goes to church is not at all a problem here. People probably may even feel good about it. It's definitely something that's perfectly acceptable. And maybe even in the small town Indiana where I grew up, it still might be viewed as a good thing, at least culturally, to be Christian, even though most people there, again, really aren't, in a sense. At the same time, the environment is very different. So all the same ideologies about gender and race are present in the public schools here in the town where I grew up, etc. There's no escape from it. And so the official institutions of society, the organs of society, the media that you consume, the movies that you watch, for example, using yours, are all basically in line with this new negative world. So I think there's a sense in which things are different on the ground, but also a sense in which there is this, stuff that's broadcast into your life, whether you want it to be or not.
In a time where culture is much more ubiquitous, a national culture, in one sense, is ubiquitous, that every person everywhere knows who Taylor Swift is if they're of a certain age category. You may despise thinking about the music or pop culture, but you've heard the name if you walk the aisles at a grocery store, or if you know any kids. You've heard that.
Well, I have to say, I disagree with that one a little bit. We definitely lived in a mass culture society up through, say, the 1990s, into the 1990s. But really, starting in the 1990s, we began to see a great fragmentation of that mass common culture in America in favor of much more hyper-splintered environments. You and I know who Taylor Swift is, and so there are some people like that. But you would be amazed that Generation Z people do not know who the cultural icons of Generation X or even millennials are, much less boomers. When I grew up, I watched many of the same TV shows in reruns that maybe my parents' generation watched. I watched I Love Lucy. I watched Leave It to Beaver. I watched old episodes of the Mickey Mouse Show in black and white. And now they're, because we had 4 TV stations and you only could watch what was on them. Well, now, there's so many huge Gen Z influencers on TikTok that we've literally never heard who they are. And there's a guy, and this is one of the biggest names out there. His name is Andrew Tate. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Yes.
But he's an online men's influencer that essentially, I would say 75+% of teenage boys are watching his content, which is not good content, by the way. I was just in a men's gathering several weeks ago, and I asked people how many people had heard of Andrew Tate. Only a quarter of the audience had heard of him. And so there's a huge generation gap there, and here's a guy who's been widely reported on in the major media. So I do think today there is a sense of there's still media, mass media, broadcast media, but there's also a sense in which social media has fragmented it, and people are now following influencers on social media that most people have never heard of, and it's much more bifurcated generationally. You can't assume that a Gen Z person, knows what you're talking about if you talk about Paul McCartney, for example.
Right. Interesting. Well, that is a helpful way to approach this, because, yes, we are limited and blinded to a degree by our own generational influences. The way that we grew up is automatically the way we think that everyone is growing up, and that the things that that we receive, not just who the icons are, but that the cultural medium is the same. And what I'm hearing you say is it's not, because there's so many more opportunities for people to get their message out.
And I think that this fragmentation has some benefits in the sense that, we can essentially curate a network of influences, whereas when I was growing up in southern Indiana, you were limited to what was in the Louisville newspaper and what was on TV, the three networks. That was your sole window into the world, or what you were taught in school. Now, of course, there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation and all of that stuff. It legitimately is a lot of issues, lots of conspiracy theories, lots of stuff that isn't true. But you actually can meet people who think like yourselves, and you have access to alternative sources of information that never existed before.
Well, in the beginning of your book, after you lay out the three worlds, then you emphasize, and the majority of your book is given to strategies, which makes it unlike most social critiques found in conservative publishing today. Everyone has a list of problems, and they have their own chosen date to which they say this is where it went wrong. But very few have very much to say about what to do. Probably, the type of book I think about Patrick Deneen's book on liberalism, a few years ago, when he, just a blast against not just political, like progressive liberalism, but also classical liberalism, saying that they're the same. But then at the end, it's the applications be more like de Tocqueville, and not very much in the way of help. So you give a lot to strategies. Going back to go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I try that because and that is about 75% of the book. But I think it's important to answer the question, okay, now what do we do? And so I give a set of starter ideas across three dimensions of the personal, the institutional, and the missional. So the personal being, how should we live as individuals and families? The institutional being, how should our churches, ministries, even businesses respond? And then mission, mission is how do we carry out the Great Commission as well as engage culturally and politically? And there are sort of like three ideas for each of those, so kind of 9 total ideas. In part, which I picked because Rod Dreher, his book, The Benedict Option, which in many respects is similar to mine, it's different, but there's a lot of similarities. He had a ton of suggestions, and I thought maybe some people were overwhelmed by the quantity of things that he talked about. So I wanted to limit how many things I talked about in each category.
Well, and it is helpful that you put them into categories for the individual, the institutional, and the missional. So for many, though, again, going back to the generation gap, when I was growing up as a part of a family who was closely connected to, Christian right, that kind of thinking, moral majority type, and you say early on in your book that the idea of culture warriors is something that would develop and really could only develop in a positive world, in that positive world from 64 to 94. But many people today are still trying to appropriate the culture war mindset, thinking this is the way it should be, we should do it. So how is it that the culture war idea would develop in a positive world? Because one would think positive world, well, you don't have to fight. I mean, there's not something to go to war for. So how does that work out?
Well, the positive world starts in 1964 because prior to 1964, we essentially had not a state church like in Europe, but a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. The positive world, what I've called the positive world, is actually the first stage of decline of Christianity in America. So it's really about 1964 that Christianity starts to go into decline, a decline that continues to the present day. And it's just that although it was declining, it was still viewed positively. And so all was not going well for the church during the positive world. I think we should be clear about that. And I think in many respects, the culture war and the seeker sensitivity model, which also arose in that era, were reacting against the decline. These were different reactions to decline.
So thus far then, what has the reaction been to your book up to this point? How does it break down? You can talk about generationally, you can talk about politically, however you want. Take that in whatever direction you want.
Well, the book has been very well received. I was anticipating that I would get much more criticism than I actually got. It makes me think I should have been more controversial. I thought there was enough controversy in there, but apparently not. I will say when I put out my theses in the First Things article in February 22, there were a lot of different reactions to that. So I think that the reactions varied by which of the different evangelical groups you were part of. So I talk about culture war, which is the religious right we know. I talk about seeker sensitivity, which is basically the sort of non-denominational suburban megachurch, if you want to think of that. And I talk about cultural engagement, which is more the Tim Keller style urban church, the emerging church, that sort of thing, and more intellectually oriented. And what I basically said was the culture war people basically did not react to my stuff at all. They obviously did not read the book. They didn't read the article. No, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but I'm not getting a lot of interactions with culture war people by and large. The cultural engagers reacted pretty negatively to it. They pushed back against this idea of it. And I think that's a little less the case today. In part, I updated the way I talked about things and I pre-addressed some of their criticisms in the book. And I think that now the culture's changing has become so undeniable that it's not tenable to push back against it. But they didn't like it. And then I think that the kind of seeker-sensitive megachurch people, they were the ones that loved it the most. They continue to be the people who like it the most. I think because I gave them a language to make sense of what they were already seeing. So they were already seeing all these changes in the cultures. They just didn't have a framework. They didn't have languages, labels to put on it. And I helped them just organize their thinking a little bit, which is sort of the consultant background in me. That's sort of what consultants do. So I didn't tell them that the world had changed. I think they were sensing it. They were seeing a lot of it. And I just gave them, this is what it is. This is what all this stuff I'm seeing it is. And so the megachurch people really liked it.
That is fascinating that would be the case. But at the same time, megachurch people have for years relied on analysts to help them read what's going on. So, I mean, this is what you're doing. This is right. Part of your gifting. So
now I will also say, I used to work for a firm called Accenture. So it was, corporate consulting in the mainstream, Fortune 500 world. And I think that a lot of the people that have traditionally been doing advisory in the evangelical world come from a very different background. So I think my professional background equips me to think about the world a little bit differently than them. But you're right, these guys, their kind of model is built on relevancy to cultural trends. And so they definitely have to be attuned to what's going on, which may be one reason they're interested in what I have to say. They're like, we have to adapt to what's going on. Whereas I feel like the cultural engagers feel more threatened.
It will require potentially more hurdles for them to jump, and there's more to give up potentially for right. Some of them.
Right, exactly.
So what is then the biggest roadblock and this is not related directly to your writing, but just what do you consider the biggest roadblock that keeps Christians from being aware of the cultural surroundings of, the common saying right now in conservative circles is know what time it is. Well, why is it so hard for many to realistically to know what time it is?
Well, first off, most of us are not really capable of change at any significant level, to be quite honest. There's also an old saying, you can't get somebody to understand something if his job depends on him not understanding it. And the point of this is all of these three models have built institutions and essentially careers on a particular strategy. And if the conditions in the marketplace change that make that strategy less viable, that means they would really have to change in some way. And that's a very difficult thing to do. In general, what you've seen is kind of new waves of change and adaptation have tended to come from new religious entrepreneurs. The new younger church planter is the guy who innovates. It's not the successful megachurch pastor who changes the model of the church to adapt. And so that's, of course, it's one of the theories behind Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen's idea of the innovator's dilemma. It's, that he talks about why basically large corporations can't innovate. And it always takes a startup to do the innovation. And those innovations end up disrupting the establishment corporations. And you would think that if they were understood that they could be disrupted by startups, they would be more innovative. But there are a whole host of structural factors that militate against that. And so the same thing affects churches as well. That's just the reality.
This is similar to, I know you've read William Lind on fourth generation warfare and his perspective on how it is best for a military force to be adaptable based on the needs on the ground. But then once you've built an institution that has a lot of bricks and mortar involved, it's a lot harder to adapt at that point.
Sure. So, our military was built to confront the Soviet Union and Europe in tank battles and nuclear. And then we found out that we had to fight these insurgents. And it took a long time to figure that out in Iraq. And in fact, we never really cracked the code on it. The Taliban are back in charge in Afghanistan. And the government in Iraq is not necessarily a friend to the U.S., and so, we were sort of disrupted there. And now, the military is changing again. Now that we see this Russia-Ukraine war, it's a conventional war again, but now it's tremendous innovations technologically in terms of tactics around things like mass swarms of cheap drones. So that's another change that makes it very difficult to do it. Definitely a challenge.
So shifting a little bit to just something I've noticed about your writing, you distinguish throughout the book that you are writing especially to evangelicals. And you are one of the few evangelical writers that I know who has publicly called out the lack of evangelical representation among the conservative elites. If that's not an oxymoron, and should say conservative elites, but because honestly, most of those positions, you look on the Supreme Court, you have mainline and Roman Catholics as far as who are the conservative wing of the court, and has been for a long time. So what is it? Because I know that's not something. People don't go into writing saying, I want to make a name for myself by making this distinction. So you're motivated in some way. What is it that motivates you to communicate that principle? so clearly?
Well, maybe like a lot of people who have a little bit of a tech background, I'm towards the Asperger's end of the spectrum or something like that. Not that I have that condition, but it's very difficult and unusual for people to go against sort of consensus or say something genuinely new. We talk about uniqueness and authenticity and innovation and creativity, but the fact of the matter is most people are extraordinarily conformist and conventional and never color outside the lines. And so for whatever reason, I find it hard to not do that, which is, it's a strength. It's sort of the foundations of part of what I've said. But of course, it also, is a challenge as well because, the people who run these institutions don't want to hear anything that's outside their parameters. And so it's a double-edged sword, to say the least.
Well, and at the same time, this actually gets to something I was going to ask later, but it's a good time to ask it now. You have specific strengths that you've used as an analyst and consultant. And now you are using those strengths in your writing, in your communication. I know you, just in your reading, you read books that are not on the regular, everybody's got to read this bandwagon that passes in the various circles. So how did you discover what your strengths, what your gifts and abilities are? And then combine those or focus on doing work where you can use those together. Because there's a lot of people, I'm convinced, who don't really know what their real strengths are. And they go about just kind of flailing. And, at best they're treading water, which at least they're not going under. But, what did you do to help focus your energies and your strengths together?
Well, first off, if anybody's listening, there's a tool called the Gallup Strengths Finder that helps you find your strengths. I don't think I've ever done it. What I would say is, the work that I do is an accumulation of multiple skills that I've acquired over the years. So I do have an orientation towards systematizing and structural analysis and things, and I'm a writer. I'm a decent writer. I'm not an exceptional writer. There's some types of writing I'm bad at, like fiction writing. I know finance and accounting at a basic level. I know software. I know how to do public speaking. I've studied a little bit about public policy and urbanism. I study conservatism. And so what I do is I've had this like layers of skills that I've built up over a long time. And those skills kind of congeal. So the skills I learned in consulting, I then applied in my policy work. Now the work that I'm doing of cultural analysis draws on the whole history of everything that I've done. And so it's cumulative to get better. And I think, maybe it's not that case for everybody, but for me, it's really even only now that all of my skills and experiences are starting to congeal in something that's, powerful at a level that makes an impact on, the church and society. Like this negative world thesis, which has become essentially the way evangelicals talk about the world that we're in today. It's gone beyond me. It's overflowed into the zeitgeist, if you will, and which I'm very gratified for. But that's the sort of thing it took 50 years of life to get to, in a certain sense.
So you're 50 years old then?
I'm 54 actually.
Okay. So that is something that I have. Well, I'll just say I appreciate, and I will use you. I will add you to a list of other men that I know who, for a long time, would just labor well in relative obscurity, but who would continue to grow and pursue excellence in their particular areas who would read things that interest them, and then those things do really come together at a particular time. So I have a friend who's a church historian in Europe who he's brilliant, and he's now written probably 15 or 20 books, but he did not write his first book until he was almost 50.
Wow.
But he spent all, he would read and write and teach but he grew. So this is a helpful message, because the pressure to perform right now is really strong. And you, of course, people want to be faithful with their gifts, but when you have the pressure to put out something immediately, it keeps you from that time of being patient and willing to work slowly, and then, as you have, produce something that will, I don't think it's a stretch to say that it will affect the way that American Christians look at the world for a generation.
Well, I hope so. And I hope I'm able to do more things like that. But believe me, I feel the pressure myself, because I'm not primarily like sitting in a think tank in D.C. where I can just publish a research paper whenever I come up with a great conclusion or something like that. Writing on my Substack and different places, I have to put up multiple pieces of content every week. And believe me, I feel the pressure to be able to keep saying insightful things on a regular basis. It's definitely like a lot of work. Make no mistake about it. And yeah, it does take a long time. I mean, a lot of people come to me like, oh, I want to start a podcast. I want to start a Substack. And I always encourage people, basically don't do it. I mean, it's too... First off, acquiring an audience for what you're producing is incredibly difficult. Don't underestimate how difficult it is to even get 1,000 people to consume what you're doing. That's a ton by a lot of people. And so we're misled because we only see the people with 1 million followers. We don't see that almost everybody has nobody watching them. And it's just very, very, very difficult to do. And, you're going to start something, and it's do you have enough to say over a long period of time? It's one thing to say I have 2 or 3 or 5 great things to say, but what are you going to do when you've written those in 2 months? So that's one that's, you're better off pitching an article to a newspaper or something.
Right.
So it's definitely, I wish I actually could produce less content, but, I still try to come up with good stuff.
Well, as a subscriber to your Substack,
which is AaronRenn.com, by the way.
Yes.
People need to sign up for that.
Yes, AaronRenn.com, and I will post a link to that in the notes that people can look at. It's really healthy, wise things that cross the spectrum. It's not just about the church or just about politics, but it does begin with a place of helping Christians grow in wisdom. So that is something that I've pointed people to it over the years, and will continue doing that. So you stress in your book the need for building and retaining institutions. Rather, I say in the book, maybe you don't do this as much. I know you've done it in some of your other work, but the normal evangelical focus is just start something new. It's very short term. If we don't like where this is going, we'll just leave and start something over again. So what is the benefit of remaining within and helping to reform an existing institution?
Well, I don't think that there's any one-size-fits-all strategy. And we're really in a kind of an anti-institutional moment. So there's so much we could go into. I really can't address it all today. But I would say, conservatives have tended to leave and start over. So the mainline denominations are going liberal, so let's leave for the new evangelical church. New York Times is too liberal, let's start Fox News. Don't like the craziness in the city, let's move to the suburbs. California is too wacky, let's move to Texas. And so there is a sense in which kind of moving on is a time-honored American way, but also a sense in which when you leave something, you're basically ceding highly valuable territory to other people. Because I will tell you that, it's extraordinarily difficult to build a powerful and important institution, or even just a successful, sustainable institution. And in some cases, it's impossible. I don't think it would be possible to start a college today that would dethrone Harvard, right, as what Harvard is in our society. You just can't do it. Could you take over from the New York Times to be considered the paper of record? It's conceivable, but not very likely. And so there's a lot to say there. But I think don't underestimate the value of institutions. But at the same time, we also have to recognize that many of the institutions embody values that are not ours. And so the right decision, I think, is up to everyone else to make their own.
Right. It is refreshing for me just to hear your voice, though, at times saying it's not for everyone to merely leave where I am and start something else. Because I think John Ehret, who I've interviewed recently, has written for a few different places, and he's a lawyer in D.C., but he wrote about the fact that it's very difficult to get a true research grant to do actual legitimate research from your average Christian college. They don't have the money. Most of them barely have the money to keep the doors open, to pay their professors any kind of decent wage, much less for someone to go and study ancient Armenian Christian practice. That's just not, that's something you can only find in an existing institution. So that's just something to think about when we make decisions.
Right.
So then you also talk about something that is, it's just not heard in your section on the institution, referring to the church, that the letters of Paul emphasize integrity within the church and about the need to grow and improve their own integrity, and much less about transforming the world around them. And that seems like a shift from what is often spoken of, or what has been spoken of previously, which is that it's our job to help transform everything around us. That's the old Christian right going back decades. So are you how would you say the view towards transformation, what is in the negative world, how should we view that? Is transformation part of the call? Is it something that is a large percentage? How does transformation fit within the way that the Apostle Paul, and I would add Peter as well, and the other writers in the New Testament, how does that work?
Well, what I would say is this is where knowing the times is important. Ecclesiastes says there's a time for this and there's a time for that, and he goes through many of these. And the New Testament was written at a time when the church was small, the Roman Empire was pagan, the authorities were not necessarily positively inclined towards Christianity and his teachings, and therefore they were very focused internally on the life of the church, and their external focus was on making converts. later, you start to get, to sort of the Constantinian world, we see that Christianity becomes more transformational as it has greater adherence, greater institutional support. And so I think that how aggressive you can be on transformation depends on the context in which you're in. If you want to transform something, you have to have the ability to do it, which means you need the skills, the competency, the resources, and the favorable environments for it. And those environments are kind of increasingly not the case today. And so I believe there needs to be less time spent on transformation as well as trying to be relevant, and more time spent on the church living as a counterculture and as a unique community.
So as part of that, then one of the things I know that you have critiqued in the past is the fact that young men, many of them, are drawn to Jordan Peterson.
Yep.
Because he has a very strong, for one thing, he has a very strong sense of empathy with them. And he can appreciate where they are, but he does not give in like a liberal to just saying, well, there's nothing you can do about this. So he is essentially a father figure to them. And you say that I've heard you say it's a shame that pastors will, in many cases, say things like, the best thing you can do is be nice. and make sure that you always sacrifice yourself to death and don't ever stand up, because then you can be considered mean. That's one extreme. So we shouldn't be that. But then on the other hand, there is a problem that some pastors think that as a pastor they get to speak to everything, including the areas where they're obviously not qualified and it's not their realm. So what is the balance between not speaking beyond your ability and for a pastor and serving as a father to young men who crave a father?
Yeah, well, there's a lot going on there. My longest chapter in the book is actually on gender, and I barely scratched the surface. But basically, I think the church should be embarrassed to see guys like Jordan Peterson attracting millions of young men looking to them for guidance, but they're not turning to the church. And Peterson is hardly alone. The influencer market has taken over from young men and young women as well. And I think part of it is, if you look at Peterson, one thing, he's a psychologist, who was a professor at Harvard and now at the University of Toronto. He's an expert in his field and very good at what he does. And I think this is where we end up with the evangelical churches is the pastor is expected to be this all-purpose expert on everything. Well, the pastors aren't experts on everything. We need other people who are lay people who can operate as Christians and assert their expertise, not even necessarily in a church context. So that's what I'm trying to do. I have all these consulting skills, and I am putting out this analysis that's more culturally informed in my media, but I'm not a pastor or a Bible teacher, and I don't claim to be, and I never, claim that authority. And so we need a lot more people who are doing things like that at a much higher level than we're doing today.
So what I'm hearing you say is actually that the church is more than just a pastor. And that the people, in this case, the men in the church are called to learn and practice whatever skills they have in demonstrating, excellence and being fathers to the fatherless in the world.
Yes.
Well, Aaron, thank you very much for taking time to come on today. So again, Aaron's book is Life in the Negative World, Confronting Challenges in anti-Christian culture. And his website is aaronrenn.com, and subscribe to that. It's one of the few Substacks that I know of that I would say it's worth all that you pay for it.
Well, thank you for saying so.
It is that good. So thank you, Aaron. I appreciate it.
All right. Bye-bye.